Brooke Carrington. I represent the David Eccles School of Business. I am in charge of the alumni outreach for the Alumni Network. And as part of our duties, we have Alumni Speaker Series, and we're so thrilled with what we've been able to pull together today. So grateful for our speakers and moderator who are here. I'm going to give a quick introduction. On the far end, we have Sperry. He's a partner in Connor Group's Technical Accounting and IPO Services practice. He leads clients in their IPO prep and filing activities, their SEC reporting. He does acquisition accounting. He's a licensed CPA in New York. Throughout his career, he's been at PwC and the Financial Accounting Standards Board. That should get some attention for some accountants. He has extensive experience with revenue recognition, debt and equity considerations, and I am told that he is a nerd, an enthusiastic nerd in Excel. So questions could go to Jacob for that. Next to him is Shawn Nelson. He is from Lovesac. He's the founder and CEO of Lovesac, our favorite pieces of furniture. Since 1995, when he started it in his parents' basement, 2001, they started their first retail store. In 2005, he was on The Rebel Billionaire. Who can say that, right? And he won $1 million prize from Sir Richard Branson. In 2018, Lovesac went public with a $3.5 million share IPO, $54 million, and they're traded on NASDAQ. And fun fact, their first public sale was on the east lawn of the Union Building. Who knew? Next to him is Dr. Stephen Neeleman. He is the founder and vice chairman of HealthEquity. They were founded in 2002, and they are founded to repair the fractured relationships between patients and providers. He has been a practicing general and trauma surgeon here in Utah. He played football for USU. He went to medical school here at Utah, and then went on to the University of Arizona, and took the company public in 2014. And their IPO had 10 million shares, and it was $133 million IPO. They are also traded on NASDAQ. And our esteemed moderator is Dr. Chen. She is the managing partner of Mountain Pacific Venture Fund. They are a VC in the early stage life sciences companies. She has over 15 years of experience in business development and strategic communications. She deals with startups and established companies such as Novartis, Novo Nordisk, Merck, Pfizer, and Myriad Genetics. She has a resume that's also a mile long. She graduated from Harvard with honors, got her MD at Duke, and then went on to Yale for internal medicine training. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Chen, and we'll go from there.
Thank you so much, Brooke, and welcome to everyone. I'm really excited to be sitting here with this very distinguished panel. I have to admit, I'm outclassed here because I have never taken a company public. So I think the goal of today's talk is really to sort of go beyond what we can find on Google about IPOs, to answer the age-old question of to IPO or not to IPO. So first, starting with you, Steve, I actually believe that today is the actual 5th anniversary of your IPO. Is that right?
It's actually, I think today is the day our lockup expired. No, we were June 31st of 2014.
Okay.
So it's about 4.5 years.
Great. So, let's just start a little bit with a sort of general question. I think it's often thought that, that an IPO is the pinnacle of business success. But let's talk a little bit about, the months leading up to the decision to IPO a company. What considerations are there? How did you look at your company and decide, yes, we are ready to go public?
I'll go first. So we started the company in 2002, and like any startup, really struggled for the first several years. And around 2010 became profitable, and never had any debt. And so as we kind of were storming into the 2013, 2014 time period, we had a lot of inbound interest from competitors talking about acquisitions and things like that. And so we went out and hired bankers. I mean, I think everyone knows this, but in order to execute a IPO, you need kind of three types of people in your corner. You need 4 if you count your board, but you need your board, and then you need bankers, you need auditors, you need lawyers. And so plan on spending a lot of money on all 3 of those. Thankfully, the bankers are kind of working on a commission, so you don't go public, they don't get paid. But the other folks, the auditors and the lawyers, they get paid whether you go or not. And so we kind of assembled the team and went through this process, and it was about a 6 or 8 month process. In fact, Christine, my wife, and I were in the land of her birth. I remember right when the process got kicked off in, I want to say, early January of 2014. And they said, get your butt on a plane and fly home from Kona and cut your trip short because you need to be here for these meetings. And so, thank you, Christine. I'll take you back in June. But anyway, so it was an all hands on deck effort, but you kind of had to do it in secret, right? Because we didn't want our team members being confused or distracted by it. And so that process over that kind of 6 or 7 months, starting early January through July 31st and everything that led up to it, and there's all these details, was what I would consider to be a refining process. In fact, had we never done it and we just stayed private, and we could have, because we had no debt, right? I mean, we had, I don't know, 40, 50 million bucks in the bank when we went public. So this was not paying off a bunch of debt. It was not expansion. In fact, when we did it, my brother, who had taken a couple other companies public, we told him that part of the proceeds were going to go to pay a dividend, and he said that will never fly. And we wrote a $50 million dividend check to our investors the day after we closed. So it was a unique offering, but it was just kind of really refining and saying, where do we want to take this company? And at the end of the day, we said, look, in order for us to be a brand that everyone knows, we're dealing with people's money. We manage billions of dollars of people's healthcare dollars. We ought to be public anyway because we're dealing with people's healthcare information and their dollars. And so that was kind of the thing that led up to it, but it was that kind of that refining process of 7 months of just being, kind of in each other's face saying, do we really want to do this, that I think made us a better company.
Shawn, do you have something to add?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, Lovesac is, at the other end of the spectrum. Tiny little company that's grown like a weed right here out of the Salt Lake Valley originally. Been through venture capital right after that TV show that was mentioned that I was on that kind of led to that point, and had to go through a complete reorganization just to survive, kind of forcing us through by the VCs. So lived the ugly VC days, lived the exciting VC days as we kind of rebirthed the company out in Stamford, Connecticut, which is where we're headquartered now, in case you wondered what happened to Lovesac. We pivoted onto this couch platform that took us many years to design and then to perfect, and now it's become 80% of our business. So we have these Sactionals that could be with you the rest of your life. And I'm giving you this context so you can just follow this path of financing through. So we kind of struggled along as this little up-and-coming furniture retailer that you had to somehow be able to take seriously shopping against Pottery Barn, but we were called Lovesac, and we started with giant beanbags, right? And so that's a big, long, arduous transition. Took a lot of money, took a lot of time. And the better part of a decade. And so by it was in 2010, roughly 9, we took out the venture capital with private equity. The company was kind of humming along, becoming a serious furniture company, behaving like a furniture company. And then in 2000, it was really 15, 16, we woke up and said, look, we're doing fine, we're growing steadily, but we had, 50, 60 locations, and obviously a big web business because everything we sell can compact down and ship to you FedEx. And we woke up and said, what are we doing? We have all the same problems every other furniture company has. Rugs, lamps, bowls, baskets, overstock, out of stock, 70% off. And it's like, let's jettison that. Let's kind of let's pivot one more time to a full direct consumer model. Get out of stores. Our stores will become showrooms carrying no inventory. All this revolution we've all witnessed with companies like Casper or Peloton, all the direct consumer movement was beginning, and we saw that and decided to go that way with our unique couch that can ship to you in a box. It's very high end. It could be in any one of your homes. It's a really nice product. So we had all of this gold that we were kind of hiding. So my point is we had to really change our entire business model to get to the point that we were even sort of worthy of that next level of financing. And that's where we were and lived through that major pivot from 2016-17. And it was, so that year leading up to it now, up to the IPO, we really should have by every other, in any other scenario, we should have actually sold to the next largest private equity group is what should have happened. We should have done the next deal. And that's what's happening right now. There's so much money floating out there in venture and private equity that is looking for a place to grow. There is so much money, like more than $1 trillion on the sidelines looking for a place to grow, that if you have a good concept, theoretically you should be able to raise money handily, and valuations in many cases are really quite ridiculous. We should have done that, but we were a victim of our own history. As I'm sure many of you in this room who are from Salt Lake are probably guilty of as well, like Lovesac. I thought they went out of business, or Lovesac, aren't they the beanbag company? Right? And so I think our perception in private equity land was, yeah, they're bumping along at 10, 20% growth, whatever. We knew that we had this direct consumer model. We were testing and advertising. We were really blowing up the business. And now, if you felt like looking at our results, the business is now growing at a 60% clip, through third quarter public information of this year, building on 100 million in sales the year previous, right? So that's the context, but that part hadn't happened. And that's the tricky part of our example. And I'm only sharing it with you so you can kind of see there isn't a right answer. The private equity groups were not giving us the valuations we felt we deserved, that we knew we could get, we knew we should get based on that model. They were looking at us like in the traditional way, and this is a very important nuance, right? They were looking at us like, well, a furniture company, retailer, right? Maybe 8 times, 10 times EBITDA. We have no EBITDA practically. We're basically cash, we're basically break even at that point. Had we been a 2-year-old startup with the same product and the patents and everything else we have and the same momentum, probably worth $1 billion. But ironically, we were neither this nor that. So my point is, for us, going public was the best option. In other words, we believed that we could see a valuation that was more appropriate for us. We kind of came out at about 2 times revenues, which a high growth company, that's pretty good. If we were a tech company, it might be 7, 8, 9, 10 times revenues, losing money like a sieve, like most of them do. Seriously. And therein lies a very important nuance, right? The positioning of your company. So luckily, we ended up in a middle place where we certainly were not ultimately positioned as a retailer or because we weren't, or as a furniture company. Otherwise, my company would be worth very little. But if you look today, the company's doing great. We have a good, healthy valuation. We're somewhere between those two places at a couple times go forward revenues and climbing. And I feel like very happy with that, right? Because if you go and price yourself too high at an IPO or frankly any deal, including private equity, then you run the risk of having to run a perfect business. Because you have to live up to the valuation you set for yourself. And so I'm obviously giving I'm touching on a number of topics here, but our path to IPO and the decision to do it was a circuitous one and not necessarily a straightforward one. But for us, it really became the best option, and it's worked out, thankfully, great.
So, I think it's great to hear all of the background and the way that you got here. And you talk about, I think a lot about it, this is about timing. So for you, Steve, or for you, Shawn, as you were thinking about IPO, how did you decide and how did you narrow in on the right window of opportunity for you?
Sure, I'll continue, I guess. So again, for us, it was at the time when we were deciding to IPO, we were also unofficially kind of putting feelers out for these private equity opportunities and not really finding them, not really being seen for what we were, right, as I described. And so we could have just continued on, and our private equity sponsors that were there could have continued to carry us, but they had been in now for, at that point, 7 or 8 years. And so anyone who's familiar with that cycle, it's time for them to get out or find some kind of exit. And by the way, it's important to just keep in mind, an IPO is a very slow exit. You IPO, even as a private equity group, and often in our case, for instance, it was going to be all prime capital, meaning the money comes into the business. It wasn't to take out my equity or the private equity's money, right? So they'll be selling off their position, as it were, for many years. And the same could be true for a founder. So it's important to know that going into an IPO. So the timing is important because for us, the markets were super hot, as we all know, in the summer of 2018, last year. No one knew what was going to happen, as we went through this volatile period in the winter. And I felt a lot of anxiety from my private equity group, who I believe at the time was antsy. Once we had decided that an IPO was possible, and then we had to do everything that Stephen described, get the accountants on board, get all the audits. Luckily, Lovesac, as small as we were, was a pretty tightly run company to begin with. We had a deep public experience CFO, and if you don't have one, I don't know how you could survive. It's not even in my view, if you don't have that, if you don't have a CFO with pretty meaty public experience, I think it would be very dubious to even approach an IPO. I think that's just, for me anyway, I think it's really important. But luckily, we were running as a private equity board-run, proper business for many years. And so it wasn't a big stretch for us to get the audits touched up, and the attorney's part, all very expensive. Once you commit, you're spending big money. You're spending, hundreds of thousands, ultimately millions of dollars on fees that you won't get back. The bankers get on board, you got to pick the right bank, and you got to pick the one for your size, and you got to hope that the timing holds. And in our case, luckily, we came out just at the end of a very hot market. Obviously, in hindsight, had we known the volatility, which you'll never know that was coming, we might have delayed it. But at the same time, everyone on that team that I just described, from the auditors to the bankers to the SEC themselves, are just pushing. Every day matters. You're on a very tight timeline. You got to then go do the roadshow and sell to investors, cram it all in to catch a window that's good. Because if you happen to put all this in motion, spend all that money, and randomly the market tanks on you, or it becomes a very bad situation. And so timing is, of course, key. But of course, that's a difficult thing to manage. If all the smart money could manage the timing in public markets, then there'd be a lot more money made in public markets.
It's a lot of variables. So just real quick, we had investors that came in late 2002, friends and family, and then we had our first private equity money come in late 2006, and so by the time we got to 2014, we had folks in the money in the company for 12 years. Plus we had the private equity folks in for 8, and then we started getting all this inbound interest because we were profitable and people knew this, and healthcare was kind of our version of healthcare was kind of heating up, and so it was just all this inbound interest. We felt like we had to hire a banker. Banker went out, did some analysis, and said, we think you can get a private equity offer for this much. And private equity offers don't come without strings, right? They'll give you more if you have an earn out and all that other stuff. Or if you went to the public markets, and there were some comps out there, we think it could be X plus 50% or whatever. So that's when we kind of dug in. The one thing I will say about timing is, for those of you that have been through this, it's pretty remarkable, because what you do is you kind of get your book put together, you have your team in place, and then you go out and you do these things called test the water meetings, where you go out and you meet with the firms that you'll be meeting with like in 6 weeks. The investors. These are public investors, and you're doing test the waters. You're saying, this is our story. We're not telling you how much we're selling the stock for yet, but are you interested? And then they give you feedback, you go back and refine the model. Well, we were doing TTWs in I want to say late May, early June, and then the markets dipped a little bit. And it's like, we're going to do this thing, and it was like, what happens on August 1st? Every one of these private or these public company investors are all in the Hamptons for the next month. So you either get this thing priced July 31st, or you come back like post Labor Day. That's how
that's a real thing.
It's totally true. They're like, just go out and screw around for a month at the Hamptons. Now, the rest of the other 11 months, Monday through Friday, they are strapped to their desks because they are, and that was amazing doing the test of waters and the IPO Roadshow, how every one of these firms you'd pull up and there'd be like 8 black Suburbans parked out in front, and it's just IPO after IPO presenting to them, so they take the month of August off. So if you're thinking about doing it, don't come up against the August deadline, or you're going to have a crappy July. Let's put it that way. It's true, isn't it?
I've had that crappy July. It's not fun.
So I'm wondering if any of you can comment on, we've talked a lot about the team that goes into preparing for an IPO, and that's going to include internal stakeholders within your company as well as outside counsel. So any advice on how you put together the right team?
Well, I think you got to start with the right auditor or the right accountant, right? Isn't that the key?
Yeah, definitely. I think part of it is knowing what your team needs to look like after the IPO, right? So there's a big question: is how much do you want to do yourself? How much help do you want to have? So in Shawn's case, he had a pretty tight ship already. audits were clean, that's a huge help. But if you know that, like, a lot of biotechs don't need a lot of accounting or legal, like, in-house, so they don't need to, that's not the right decision for them to go hire 3 people to push through an IPO and then lay 3 people off 6 months later. So that's where advisors could help out at a lot. So when you're doing an IPO, they mentioned there's a lot of time. If you picture in your head, like, I feel like the guy, the bellhop who's trying to bring in a lot of somebody's luggage, for somebody who overpacked for a trip. That's what it's like to be kind of on the accounting side of one of these things. But I think definitely knowing what your company needs to look like after the IPO, finding the right set of people that have done it before. You definitely want that mix of institutional knowledge, people at your company, that know your story, that know what your data looks like, are really, really helpful when you've got to slice it and dice it in all the different ways that you need to fill out a filing.
Yeah, I would just add, I think a big, in building out that team, both internally and externally, in my opinion, size matters, right? And what I mean by that is, there are so many different bankers that play in different strata who really have their sweet spot with different public investors, whether it be microcap, small cap, mid cap, right, and on. There are so many different attorneys, by the way, who play in those circles. There are so many different accounting firms, or even groups within those accounting firms. I think, like, finding a good fit for you is really important, because if you get, it's always sexy to get, bigger is better, or think like, oh, a big name, a big Wall Street name, whatever it may be, but that may not be the right bank for you, for sure. I can tell you, in our case, we ended up using a pretty small niche bank called Roth Capital that's based in Southern California, that for those who know them, they know them well. For those that don't, they're not a Goldman Sachs, they're not a Morgan Stanley, they're not a, and there's, by the way, 100 others that I could list. But they were the right size for us, and their exposure to the investors was the right size. And so somehow you got to navigate that land, and it's difficult, because if you've been running a company and focused on running a company, this is all new territory probably. Now they may have been circling, and that's why I would encourage you to, like, be going to the conferences, be networking all the time, and even things that seem like this event, where you get to hear from someone like Jacob here. You get exposed and you start to get a feel for different firms, different professionals, where they fall in the strata and the landscape, and just finding the right size partners at each one of those, for each one of those elements is, in my opinion, really important.
Can I just make one comment about internal team?
Absolutely.
So we had this, I think it may have been more awkward for other people than me, but it seemed like it was awkward for me. I had ran the business for 12 years as a CEO. About 3-4 years before the IPO, we brought in a guy that's remarkable, intelligent guy, and the plan was for him to kind of run the business. And they kept my title as CEO. And frankly, I was fine being kind of like the face of the business, the founder, being out at conferences and speaking, and really kind of being the sales guy. And I was fine with him running the business. But the bankers were a little bit, so you're the CEO, he's the executive chairman, he runs the business, it's really awkward, the investors aren't going to know who to believe in. And I was like, look, it may be more awkward for you than me, and it may be awkward for other people in my family that think I'm going to, like, be demoted, but I really don't care about that. What I care about is that we put the right team in front of the right people to sell this company. And so we changed my title. That was in late December of 13, and I became kind of the vice chairman, founder guy, and John Kessler became our CEO, and then we had our CFO. And then the question was, well, who's going to go out and tell this story? And I think we made the right decision. I mean, look, we priced at $14 a share. This was, 4.5 years ago, and we were trading up from that, and we've had a nice run. And you always knock on wood because things change in the public markets, but what the plan we made was, when we went out, first test of waters and then the ultimate roadshow, was have all 3 of us there. And I would kind of lay the context. This is why I founded this company. This is why we think we're the best. This is how we think we're changing the lives of millions of Americans. John would talk about how the business is operated. Darcy would talk about the financials. And I think in retrospect, the investors like that, because oftentimes you got a founder that comes in and has a great idea, runs a great company, and then private equity comes in and they switch the founder out, and the founder is all ticked off and leaves, right? And you can think about a bunch of people, Jobs, Steve Jobs.
No, I
top
mean,
of the
I
list.
essentially kind of lived that. I just didn't get all the way out. And I'd like to build on what you said in a second, because I totally agree with where you're going with this.
So anyway, I think we did it right, but it took some humility on my part, and I was okay with a guy that grew up in Miami and lives in California coming in and being the CEO of the company. And it took humility on his part, knowing that the founder's hanging around, kind of hanging around the hoop, you know? And so I think it just, you know, I was in a business of undergrads here a few minutes ago, and I said, go read Jim Collins' good, great book, and aspire to be a level 5 leader. Because if you can have that combination of grit where you will tear through a wall, but then be humble and be willing to say, I'm not the smartest guy in the room or gal in the room, I think that's what, but that being said, things change quickly.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think that's my experience isn't actually so different. And just to give you ideas about structure on the internal team, I think it's very similar in my case, and I'm very grateful for it. So same thing, 3 of us go on the road. In my case, you know, I'm the CEO founder guy. I've got a COO president who effectively runs my company day to day and does so. I mean, by the way, he's got.
That's how you live in St. George.
Bingo. And by the way, which was also a personal decision, right? So it's been fantastic for every reason, including personal reasons. I moved back to St. George in the last year and a half. We're spinning up an HQ2 down there for those of you who are Utah. And it's cool. We're back to being a little bit of a Utah story. And I'm on planes all the time. I'm in Stamford, Connecticut. I'm here, there. But I was always on planes all the time. We have showrooms all over the country. There's financial conferences all over the country all the time. So if you got to travel from somewhere, travel there. And my point is, by having a robust team, in my case, it's CEO, president, and a CFO that's amazing. That is exactly what, in my view, what investors want to see, because, you know, they, as much as it's, I don't know, in your own head cool to be the guy who can do everything, nobody believes that. Nobody believes anybody can do everything. And so to have a team that's better than me, for sure, on paper and in reality, literally, like all the books say, but for real, that's true. But the neat thing is it frees me up to actually do the other aspect of this job, which once you become public, you can either just put on the blinders and go run a good business and put up good quarterly results. And by the way, you'll have success as long as that's true. As long as the growth is there and the results are there, your stock, I'm sure, will do well. But I believe there's 2 games afoot. The most important game is the performance game, no question. And even with a partnership, there's plenty to do in the business for me and everybody else, plenty, okay? But then for me to be freed up enough to go play the other game, which is be at the conferences, do the NDRs, the non-deal roadshows, get in front of investors all the time, let them see inside the business, operate transparently, work those markets so they believe in you and they understand the business. That's almost a full-time job, believe it or not. Like I am constantly at other places. And so there's no way I could be the operator, the true operator, and do that well. And I feel like when you play both games well, maybe the results can be doubled, right? And in terms of how your stock can perform, even as your company's performing. That's my view, anyway.
I wanted to go back to something that you sort of mentioned earlier, Steve, where you were talking about, you know, during the process of IPO, things kind of had to be hush-hush because you didn't want employees to feel anxiety about potential changes that were coming. But the reality is, you know, an IPO is a process of transformation. And there's a cultural change that's going to need to happen at the corporate level, but there's a disconnect now. How did you handle that?
Look, we tried to do both. I mean, there was a period of time where we kept it totally under wraps, and we had, you know, some executive team members involved. But then the minute that we knew we were going to go, we incorporated the team. I got to tell you, it's really one of my favorite stories of the event. So we've got bankers in New York, right? And they're saying, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to price this thing in the next couple weeks. We're going to fly you back, and we're going to bring in this film crew, and we're going to film you giving your presentation. This is the road show, because you're only going to meet with maybe 50 or 80 firms, and there's going to be 1,000 firms out there that want to watch it. So they do this thing called Net Roadshow. You guys do that? And they said, so we need to film Net Roadshow, and we'll do it in New York. And I said, well, how much is that going to cost? Oh, we got a film crew. It's going to be like 50 grand. And I said, yeah, we can do that in Utah for 5. And I said, we're not doing that. And I said, and plus, and we're going to fly in the day before with a road show, and you're going to film it. I said, look, I've got a CEO that is one of the smartest guys I've ever met, but he has terrible vision problems. And he's going to be reading some teleprompter. This is not going to go well. We need to like do this well. So I said, how about if you bankers fly to Utah? We'll have a film crew here do the Net Roadshow. Plus the other problem was is GoPro priced like 3 weeks before us. So they're like, yeah, just go on Net Roadshow and check out some of it. And I see the guy on GoPro like on a surfboard on his Net Roadshow with his GoPro. And it's like, there's no way we're gonna look like total fools, right? So we brought him out, and what we did was we had our team members that means so much to us sit in the audience. And we did this all day long, and we did it like 10 times, and they were filming it in the back. They are here. And the first time was pretty rough. And the funniest thing was that Kessler's, our CEO's daughter, was working as an intern. And she's on the front row watching this thing, the first one. And the bankers were in the back. And she raised her hand after. And then we said, oh, so we gave her the presentation. We said, do you have any questions? And the first guy raised his hand and goes, yeah, I could tell that on Steve's demo that it was kind of a fake demo because there was an Apple logo in the corner and you were running on a IBM machine. I'm like, yeah, whatever. I said, what else? and Kessler's daughter raised her hand and goes, she says, Daddy? And nobody heard her say Daddy. Your eyes were all over the place. She said, you were like looking like, you got to tone that down. And she said, and Darcy, our CFO, you said like 50 times. And the bankers are back there dying, right? And then we refined it, we did it again, and then finally by like the 10th take, we got it. And then we broadcasted that sucker out, and they said, hey, other than the GoPro one, yours was the best Net Roadshow we've seen in the last year. And so I think it was a team activity, but we had to involve the team at the right time. And there's still people that come up to me that remind me of John Kessler's daughter, diss him in front of the whole team, saying you got to like figure out how to read those cue cards a little bit better. So anyway, I think we did involve the team at the right time, but it wasn't until after we were ready to hit the go button, because this can be incredibly distracting for people because everyone wants to know how many stock options they got. Everyone wants to know all their RSUs and everything, and that's painful. So sorry about the long story, but it's important.
No, that's a public website, right? IPO Roadshows. If you Google it, you can watch those.
Yeah.
And I've definitely watched a few CEOs just flipping like the printed out PowerPoint that they're reading from. Yeah. So you could tell which ones must have a really good product and which ones are more sales driven. But just that story of growth, I was working on Spotify, and their project code name for the Spotify, well, they did a direct listing on IPO, but for their event, they called it Project Bieber, right? Because just like Justin Bieber is a little immature,
Yeah.
they needed to grow up, and it really was. In that case, we spent a couple years before anybody really internally. It was maybe somewhat of a poorly kept secret what Project Bieber really was, but there were years of preparation done in that case. When you're a public company, you've got a number of days, and you've got to turn around information, you've got to get it to investors, you've got, your press releases, you've got your filings and the things that needed to be put in place. But it's a lot of work and effort that goes into that.
Yeah, this is a great segue because my next question was actually for you, Jacob, because you've participated in a number of IPOs. Would love to hear what are the common pitfalls that you see companies encounter, and advice that you would give them as they prepare.
Yeah, so there's a meeting when you kick off the process called an org meeting, right? And in the org meeting, it's where everyone gets together for the first time, and it's when the lawyers pretend they like each other and everyone's very amicable, right, in this meeting. But what
Unless
Shawn,
you have to fly back from Kona, then you're ornery.
that's fair. There are probably one or two grumpy people in the room. But at that org meeting, that's when it starts, right? So there are a lot of people who are billing you by the hour in that room. And every hour of every day gets really expensive after that, to your point, Shawn. It's good for me, it's good for my kids' college funds, but nobody else is really benefiting from that. So having as much done as possible on the administrative side, and you had mentioned you had a good, strong CFO, you were already, it's not uncommon for companies, when you want to start this process, will start doing the things that you need to do. Have an internal press release, right? There companies where you'll say, well, here's the day we need the data. Can we actually close our books that fast? Do we know what our financials are? Do we have enough time to do the analysis where we can have a mock investor call? And a lot of bankers will kind of do this with you. Just let's have a call. Let's ask some of the questions that you're going to get asked if you give me a period of financials that look like that. Front loading that. having a lot of those things done before that org meeting saves you a lot of time, saves you a lot of energy, gives you more control about when you can get into that window, right? Is it the good week or the bad week? Just the evolution, one of the industries where I've seen a lot of turmoil is around ad tech. Like I was in New York for a while, and there were a whole slew of companies like Rocket Fuel and other things. They were some of the first people kind of targeting ads to you. And they're huge, one of their huge sells in the business models, they had like 40% margins. And a couple of them went public, and then a couple of them started to have bad quarters. There weren't a lot of barriers to entry. There was a whole other slew of companies that were coming in, and their pitch is they had 30% margins. And so one of my first companies that I helped to try to go public, that try was an important verb, they just got undermined because they were part of the wave that had 30% margins and was happy with that. And in the time that they were getting ready to go out, we had approved financials with the SEC. They were on their roadshow, and there was another company that came out that was bragging about having 20% margins. So just within a couple years, the expectation of what the performance of that company was going to be in that industry completely shifted, and there were a whole host of companies that thought they were doing great, were killing it, had massive valuations, and just never had the ability to go out and ended up being sold or disappearing over time. I think I started to wander a little bit.
Well, I just build real quickly on what you said. I think for me, I said it pretty clearly already, but you might wonder all the things that Jacob said. Well, how do you put? First of all, I could not believe the number of filings and just the number of check boxes that go into this. And when I say this, I really mean it's different things at different stages of that. Call it 6-month process, 3-month process, whatever it becomes. I mean, it's really insane. And so you wonder, like, well, how could I get ahead of that, or how could we be prepared? For me, that's where that CFO came in. And even if you have a great team already and you happen to not have public company experience, then hire a consultant or bring on a VP of finance, someone who has experience going through it, that knows what to expect. Because I just happen to have a workhorse CFO who grew up through public companies, and she knew the ropes and was just on it. And when I say on it, I mean almost 24 hours a day. It blew my mind how on it the attorneys were. People that work in this space, to your point, they are chained to their jobs, and they get paid for it. They get paid for it, and there's a lot of billable. There's insane bills that roll through. But from those attorneys to those bankers to your own team, there is just an unbelievable amount of work. It really is a lot. Luckily, I had the easy part. I just wind me up and turn me on and let me brag about Lovesac. And but that's a role too. Believe it or not, that's a role too. And I think
called
our
the mascot. Right. Mascot.
I want to make sure to leave time for questions, but I did want to just ask one final thing. Now, life after IPO. Would you do it all over again? If there was one thing you could do differently, what would it be?
We've been very, very lucky and very blessed. I mean, we did lose $2 billion of market cap in December, but I don't think we could have avoided that.
I wish I had $2 billion to lose. So come on, man.
But it's kind of a high-class problem to have if you're still in business after you lost it. But look, it's a grind. But I think the reason why the public markets exist is it is refiner's fire, and you have to be better every day than you were the day before. And it doesn't matter what your stock price is, and we don't sit and look at it all day long. We were told by several people, probably some people in this room, hey, did you know that you just lost $2 billion of the market cap in the last? Yeah, we said we know, and trust me. But so you got that burden, but you also say, look, we're going to wake up, and today we're going to make our solution better for our team members, and for our members, our folks who are paying our bills, and our investors than it was yesterday. And I think that's what well-run IPO companies realize is every day it starts over again.
Yeah, I would add, I actually am really happy. I think, like I said, textbook answer would have been sell to the next bigger fish, right? And then by the way, after that, sell to the next bigger. And that's what's happening in private markets is companies just keep getting passed around, the valuations keep getting crazy, and then somebody, in my view, is going to get left holding the bag when the music stops. It's like musical chairs, right? And when the music stops, it's when macro events happen, whatever, right? And someone or some group, or some, in my view, and the same thing you could say will happen in the public markets, but the difference is it's all public. It's all a level playing field. And I'm a really big fan even though like I was really nervous going through this, and there were times where, you know, because everyone would question, like, do you really want to be a public company? And it's like, well, no, but you know, this is kind of the right thing to do for us. But now that I'm on the other side of it, I actually have so much respect for it, because as I meet with investors who, these guys aren't just, you know, it's easy to portray public markets as like Las Vegas. It is not that. You know, there are aspects that feel similar, but these are very disciplined investors that dig very deep into these businesses, are given information that, you know, is a lot of information, and they slice it and dice it their way. And every firm's a little bit different in how they view it. But I've gained a lot of respect for how disciplined they are, how thorough they are, how disciplined a public company must be to disclose all that information, just to generate that information. All of a sudden, you know your business like you've never known it before. You know it cold. You know all the facts, figures, stats. And that's a really powerful place to be, right? And so the end result is a really, in my opinion, a really, unless it's, you know, not, I believe most of the time the end result is a really well-run business. It's probably the way a business should be run. And I think it's actually kind of a shame that public markets have shrunk so much, because as I view the discipline that's there compared to what I witness in private equity, no offense, I'm sure there's a lot of this in the room, but I lived through venture capital, private equity. I've lived through those realities too. And what we were able to get away with, so to speak, or the sloppiness that's involved on both sides of that coin, on both management and in private equity, call it private money due diligence, is in my mind second rate compared to the scrutiny that happens in the public markets. And so I don't mean to be caustic, but I'm really proud of like that. I'm really proud of this system that's been created and sort of honed over. Look, it has its warts, it has all kinds of red tape and all kinds of inefficiencies, but it generates, in my view, a really well-run system. And I think and that's where I think the valuations there are much more reliable for the most part, unless you're looking at big tech. Can't speak to that, but much more reliable, I think, than the rest of the world.
Any final words from you, Jacob, or should we turn it over to the audience? All right. Questions?
Let's go skiing.
Here,
This is for, I guess, everyone. I think any entrepreneur takes grit. And I don't know if you could all maybe speak to when you were younger, did you ever think you would be in the position you are today? And maybe if there's an example of something that gave you that grit. Because I'm sitting here, Shawn, with your parents who are awesome, talking about you. And so, yeah, if there's just one example for maybe any aspiring entrepreneurs to say, hey, maybe one day that's what I want to do, something they could reflect on.
I was a defensive lineman playing against a bunch of big, huge offensive linemen, and a coach named Coach Wiederquist that just was determined to kick my butt every day in practice. Part of it came from that. I was a missionary knocking on doors with a bunch of Irish Catholic folks that didn't want to hear what I had to say. I think that built part of my grit. But then, you know, on the business side, I had a little sandwich business when I was trying to, when my wife was pregnant with Lauren, my daughter who's here, and I was running around selling sandwiches to about 50 convenience stores in this city right out here. And sometimes I look out there and I'm like, man, that was tough. So, I mean, I think you're kind of a accumulation of your experiences, and that's I think where a lot of that came. So then when I got to things in medicine and then ultimately in business, it was like, yeah, I've suffered before.
Yeah, I will say this: Lovesac is a company that should not still exist. I was told how many times. So it's true. The first time we ever sold Lovesacs to anyone other than my neighbors was on the lawn at the Union Building right here as I was a student. And this was a side hustle for 3 years while I literally was waking up, going to school, doing my thing, stuffing Lovesacs in the afternoon, not making any money, never made any money. Like, you know, the van breaks, the shredder breaks, the whatever, got to buy more fabric, like waiting tables every night till 11:30, paying my way through the University of Utah, right? Luckily I had a scholarship and whatnot, but I kind of paid my own way through and lived in my parents' basement and did this thing. And I was like a reluctant entrepreneur. I mean, sure, I did all the things, like, you know, you looking back, it's like, oh, you were always an entrepreneur, maybe. But the grit, it's binary for me. There were so many times, I can't even count them. And I'm trying to write my story down right now, so I don't, because it's a really fantastic, bizarre story. I won $1 million on TV, by the way. You know what I mean? Like, everything good and bad that could. I went through full Chapter 11 bankruptcy with Lovesac. There's no reason this company should still exist. I was told it was a fad from day one. And now 20 years later, Saks, forget Sactionals. It's exploding our business. It's a really cool invention. Saks is still growing at a ridiculous rate. Saks. The Saks that were basically the same thing I was selling here, right? Making them by hand. And my point is, I can't even count the number of times where along that path where I just couldn't see a way out. I wanted to quit. I did a few times. Like I said, we're only going to do this trade show to prove that it can't work. And it didn't work. And then 10 days later, I'd get this phone call from out of state, and they said, we want to order 12,000 Lovesacs. I mean, I was wrapping the company up. And then we got the order, and then I didn't take the order. I left it with my friend and said, we can't do this. What are we thinking? We're college students. We can't afford to buy 30,000 yards of fabric. If you want to do it, you can. And then somehow decided to do it. My point is, at every one of those decision points, ultimately, I decided, because it's binary. You either quit or you don't. You either quit or you don't. There's no in between. Right? And so at every one of those decision points, somehow I didn't. And by the way, I had to live in exile in my own company for a decade, basically. In my own company through that reorg, right? And then moving out to Stanford. And now here we are on the tail end of it. And I feel like I'm really obviously proud of what we're doing. And I think, by the way, I think that we will go on to do things that will surprise everybody. But this thing that was always a fad, it's very, purportedly, right? It's a very tough thing to just keep going. So that's my message, right? Like, you either keep going or you don't. And my advice is keep going.
Can I answer the next question first? I can't follow that. That was inspiring. I think for me as a parent, the two most things that I want for my kids, the first is benevolence and the second is grit, right? I just want them to be able to, whatever the hardship is, right? If it's a decade-long odyssey or if it's just, dealing with the rough circumstance in life, if they can handle it with grit and they can handle it with benevolence, then that's like the number one thing that I want for them.
As you were going through this process, as you're private, thinking about going in public, what made you finally make that decision that you should go from being private and you could handle being public? And how did you kind of about doing that?
For us, it was that 7 months of going through the process and continuing to get a market check and knowing we had to get our investors their money back at some point, and we could start giving dividends or whatever. And when it came back and the bankers made it pretty clear that we would trade at a price provided we kept performing, and we just pulled the trigger on it. But it was 7 months of kind of careful study.
Yeah, I think, same experience. I mean, we dabbled with it, we toyed with it, we kind of did some of those test the waters meetings, lots of financial conferences, trying to get closer to it, trying to better understand it. Because, by the way, it's very mysterious. Like and I'm still living it, I'm still learning. But like the amount that I've learned in the last year, and so as an entrepreneur, I think there's also this aspect, right? Like, you're an entrepreneur or you're a founder or you're an executive. You have the chance to just go to this next level. And I won't say it's better or worse, it's different though. And the lessons you learn are different. And so for me, it's been really fun to stretch my legs there. I've been running this beanbag company for 20 years. Like, it's a lot of fun to do different things, to learn different things, to be exposed to different things, right? And to see the business flourish in an environment that's actually there's a lot of scrutiny. It's very difficult, it's very demanding. So to make that decision was kind of like, you got to kind of get closer to it and understand it and test it. You got to know what the other opportunities are, whether it's private equity or who knows, other financing. You got to deal with the realities of investors that might need an exit. And the other thing I'll add is that a public situation for many founders is a cool situation, because this myth of like control and ownership, if you watch the Shark Tank, all the clowns on there that they're afraid to give up 20% or 51%, it's all a myth. You control your company even from whatever seat you're in because you're the guy, or you're not, or you're capable, or you're not, right? Like, you're the right person to play that role. That's how you, in my view, that's how I always view. That's how you maintain control. And so my point is, going public is actually a cool way for a management team or an entrepreneur. Way more control, by the way, in my view, than you have with private equity, where you have all kinds of different motives and and where an individual can really swing your reality, like an individual inside of private equity. I don't mean to disparage. I've had great partners there. I've had actually pretty great experience, but I've witnessed private equity firms and venture capital firms just wreck companies because of a whim of one of the people that had an idea, you know what I mean, and impose that on the management team. So it's going public is actually a cool way for a team to have a different level of control over this thing they've created and generate value for themselves, liquidity for their investors.
Anyone else? I think one more question. But I'm actually really glad that you made that point, because I think a lot of people think that when they go public, they're going to lose control. So
I think it's the opposite
actually a
in
great
many ways.
perspective.
And that was actually it. Part of the question that I was going to ask is, we hear the horror stories of either how good or how bad it can be after the IPO as far as managing the company, running the company. I was just curious your perspective of how it was after the IPO. What changed?
I'll take it first because because yours will be more interesting. I'm in a honeymoon period, right? The company was doing pretty well going into it. We're doing pretty well, and I've been public for like reported 2 quarters, and so come on, like I'm in some kind of a honeymoon phase, right? It's a great question. I imagine when it gets bad, it gets worse, right? Because now you have, instead of dealing with, so I'll flip what I said. Instead of dealing with maybe one entity or one group of people, now you might have to deal with all kinds of unknowns, from, I don't know, activist investors to who knows what, right? And so I can't comment on that yet. That's, I'm sure, a very real consideration.
Yeah, I mean, and we've had a nice run, and despite the $2 billion market cap loss in December, I mean, things have gone pretty well for us. So it's hard for us to comment on but I can tell you it's just kind of it's just a constant drumbeat. You know when you're going to be reporting. They lay out the schedule at the beginning of the year, at the end of the previous year, and they say, look, we're going to be, Shawn, the non-deal roadshows, you're going to be presented at these non-deal roadshows. You're going to be presenting earnings on these dates, and you just have to keep slugging away. The one thing I will say, and this is why I think the combo of kind of salesy type people on your management team and then more operators is good, is that one of the things that our operators are always careful to do is to tamp down expectations. Because if those analysts get ahead of themselves and then you miss, you may have blown your own budget out of the water, but just because you didn't meet consensus, you're in big trouble. So thankfully, I don't have to do that, because I like to be the glass half full guy. I always say, look, I'm not going to rest until more than half of Americans have a health savings account. In fact, let me ask this question: how many people in this room have a health savings account? It's a little over half. Fantastic. See that? I can tell you, when we started this thing, it was like 2 would have raised their hands, right? And I still have big issues with the people that are running benefits at certain universities that are very close to you right now, because they don't do it right. Okay, I'm telling you that right now. And so I get to be the guy always kind of preaching the gospel of HSAs, and like everyone's going to have an HSA someday, but then I need my CFO and my CEO, and now we just brought on a new COO to be the ones that are always kind of tamping down expectations.
Now that he's done, right? No, that's the role they play, and I'll just build on what you said, because it's great. The operators play that role. Okay, like what Shawn said's nice, but let's talk about reality. But there's a role for each, right? And so to your point, to your question of, those horror stories that may come, or that we've all heard. Look, markets, I believe in a free market economy, and markets are efficient to some degree. And while there's plenty of exceptions and misses or weird situations, I think overall, I've met all these investors now, and I now understand how this game works. And they're just, look, it's really simple. They're trying to place their money where it can grow, or where it can at least not be, at too much risk. And I believe that as I sit with them and listen to them and the questions they ask me, I think there's room for mistakes. There's room for unknown. There's room for the macroeconomy to let us all down. I think a big thing is that when you see a company that lived through a horror story, there's typically a real reason for it. There's real negligence there, or there's just a failure to actually run a good business. And I think that investors are just people. They're not. It's not like, they're also quants and robots, I guess, but for the most part, the real money's moved by real people, and they're making decisions based on whether they like you, whether they believe you, whether they believe in you. And I think the opportunity to share bad news and it's when you screw up, it's when you make mistakes or you're negligent. I think that's where the biggest real misses come. You know, the $2 billion, that's not on you, that's the market, I'm sure, right? And
President
probably.
Trump. So how many of you have a Lovesac? Raise your hands. Come on.
Anyone got a Lovesac out there?
Well, I think we're out of time, so thank you all for coming, and maybe we could just get a quick round of applause for Steve, Shawn, and Jacob for sharing their experience and insight with us.